Today's sermon is called, Did Jesus Go to Seminary? Maybe you know the answer to that already, but that's what I've called it. I think he takes a very handsome graduation picture. Definitely looks way better in that cap and gown than I did, I'll tell you that. But that's what I've titled it this week, and you'll see why. When we left off last week, Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. And the reason he was on his way there is because he was going to go participate and attend during the Feast of Tabernacles, which, if you'll recall, was one of the big three, what we call pilgrimage festivals that the Jews would celebrate in their religious life. It was a religious holiday. You could just, when you hear the word festival, just think religious holiday. And it was one of the three big ones, the pilgrimage festivals. And we call it that because it was customary to take a pilgrimage into Jerusalem for these festivals. So there were three big ones, and the Feast of Tabernacles was one of them. And Jesus was on his way there. But as he's going that way, the people who were already in Jerusalem, who were already attending the feast, all they could talk about was, where's Jesus? Where's Jesus? I don't see Jesus. Is he coming? Is he here? I don't know. Where is he? Who is Jesus? I don't know. Is he a good man? Is he a trickster? But that's all they're doing, is that's all they can talk about is Jesus. Jesus is not even there. Jesus has not been there in months. But he made such a mark last time he was there that that's all they can talk about is what's going to happen, where is he, and is he coming, and all this stuff. And they can't stop talking about him. And he's not even there yet. But as we're going to see over the next few sermons, that as usual, once he does get there, a whole lot of drama is going to unfold. A whole lot of drama. He's going to be dealing with three basic groups of people throughout John chapter 7. There's going to be the pilgrims, the travelers, the ones who came into Jerusalem to attend the festival. There's going to be the people of Jerusalem, the people who are actually from that city who are coming out. And there's also going to be the religious leaders. And each one of those three groups, he's going to have particular interactions with. And each one of those interactions is going to have its own little nuance and its own little way that he's going to deal with them. But in verses 14 through 24 specifically, which we're going to be looking at today, the dominant theme, as usual, is going to be the fact that these people don't understand Jesus. The fact that they can't understand Jesus, that they're having trouble understanding Jesus. But what Jesus is going to do in this text is he's going to start pushing back a little bit. And he's going to start addressing some of these misunderstandings directly, particularly some of the sources of those misunderstandings he's going to go after. And in particular, the one that he's going to be kind of targeting today is the very, we'll just say, well-meaning, it's a very well-meaning, but ultimately misguided notion that dealing with the role of formal education in the life of the Christ follower, the role of theological training in the life of the Christ follower. This idea that if you don't have some kind of seminary degree or if you haven't had some sort of formal training, then, well, it's tough for you because I guess you'll never understand the Bible and you'll never be able to go deep. And he's going to kind of address this kind of head on. So today we're going to look at the fact that it doesn't take a seminary degree and it doesn't take a law degree. That's how we're going to break up this text today in the life of a Christ follower and somebody who wants to go deep. You want to go deep in your studies? You don't need a seminary degree. You don't need a law degree. You don't need formal training. You don't need some sort of advanced education. That's not what it takes. What does it take? Well, that's what we're going to find out today. If you have your Bibles with you today, would you please flip with me to the Gospel of John, chapter 7. Today we're going to start in verse 14. We're going to read on down to verse 24. And again, the question we want to ask is, did Jesus go to seminary? And either way, what would his attitude towards that be today? That's what we want to talk about. So let's read together, starting in verse 14. Here's what the word of the Lord says. It says, about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? So Jesus answered them, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority, he seeks his own glory. But the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? The crowd answered, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Jesus answered them, I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but it's from the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. So my first encouragement to you today, my first bit of encouragement, when it comes to following Jesus, when it comes to going deep with Jesus, when it comes to going deep in your faith and going deep in the scriptures, there is no seminary degree required. No seminary degree required. As it happens, when I first started teaching Sunday school back in 2008, it just so happens I had most of the people in my class were actually seminary students. New Orleans is a big seminary town. We have a seminary in Gentilly. And most of the people in my class were seminary students. And at the time, I was only a believer for about 3 years. I had about 3 years under my belt. And for the first 2 of those years, I grew not much at all in any capacity, any category. I had not been discipled. Nobody had really poured into me in that way. I didn't know what I was doing. I just hadn't grown that much. I was starting to grow in my 3rd year, but I didn't have much knowledge of the Bible. I was a blank slate. There was so much I didn't know. And I was aware of how much I didn't know. And for me to think about teaching these seminary students, quote unquote, teaching seminary students, in my mind, seminary students walked around with the whole Bible memorized. They just, it's like they're a computer for the Bible. And I was so intimidated thinking how in the world am I supposed to teach seminary students? I'm just this nobody. And how am I supposed to teach these people? And they were very gracious, but I went in there, and what I did have was a lesson plan. I had this lesson plan with the curriculum on it, and what I will say is I studied that lesson plan frontward and backward. I did not go in there unprepared from that perspective. I studied that thing forward and backward, but as far as the Bible goes, man, I knew if the conversation veered from that lesson plan, I was toast. I was scared. And so there was this intimidation factor is what happened. I was intimidated at the thought of teaching these seminary students. Now, full disclosure, not to offend anybody in here who's been through the system, but the more seminary students I've gotten to know over the years, the less inclined I feel to put them on a pedestal. All right, I'm just going to say that. And that's not to throw anybody under the bus. It's just that I came to realize, hey, guess what? They're people. They're people just like everybody else with quirks and foibles. But what I had done without even realizing it, without even meaning to, without being consciously aware of it, is I had fallen into this trap. And it's a trap that I think a lot of people today continue to fall into, and it's a trap that plagues a lot of Christians, and it's this idea. And if you think about it, if you really think about it, maybe you will see some of yourself in this. But it's this idea that there is sort of like this tiered system to the Christian life. Like levels, like a top-down hierarchy. And, you got the pastor kind of like here, and then under him, you've got, maybe Bible study teachers, Sunday school teachers. Right under that, you have the seminary students. They're training, and they're not quite there yet, but they're on their way there. Way up here somewhere, you've got the international missionaries. Because they almost need their own chart. We can't even touch them, right? I mean, they're not anything like us, right? But then kind of like under the seminary students, well, then there's just, there's us. There's the regular Christians, we're the regular Christians. And if you just dig into your minds a little bit, maybe you've kind of thought of it this way. Maybe you've kind of viewed this system where you want to put people on different pedestals depending on like how far through the system they've gone. But what this can do, first of all, I want to say that this is wrong thinking. Okay, I'll be the first one to tell you, as a product of the seminary system, this is wrong thinking, first of all. This can lead to the kind of intimidation I was just talking about. It can absolutely lead to that, but it can also lead to a level of complacency. It can lead to a level of complacency whereby, you get this false idea in your head that less is required of me if I am a regular Christian. That there's not as much put on me. Not as much is required of me. I don't have the same level of responsibility. I don't have to go as deep. I don't have to study my Bible as much. I don't have to go to Bible study as much. I don't have to do these things as much. Surely God is calling these other people to do more than he's calling me to do. We just don't have the same level of responsibilities to grow, to learn, all that kind of things. I can tell you, well, first of all, again, that attitude is incorrect. We're going to kind of walk through that a little bit, but that's the attitude we see right here in this passage. This is the attitude we see expressed when these people start talking in this crowd. So Jesus shows up in verse 14, and if you notice, it says he shows up halfway through the festival. The brothers last week wanted him to go with them. They wanted him to go up with everybody else. Jesus said, not yet. So Jesus waits till about halfway through the festival when everybody's already kind of in place. And then when he does reveal himself, he does it at the temple. He's like, I'm not here to party. I'm here to teach. And he shows up at this temple, and that's where he makes his big reveal. And just for the record, he's not inside like the temple building. Okay, when we say the temple in this text, in this context, what we're talking about is those outer courts of the temple where things like this happened. All right, this is that court of the Gentiles where the big crowds could gather. Coincidentally or incidentally, this is where a few sermons ago he was when he cleansed the temple. This is where he was when he, overturned those tables and ran those money changers. He's back in the same place, and he's teaching. And here's the thing: we don't even know what he's teaching. This is one of those times where I'd love to know what he was saying. We don't know. It doesn't say. All we know is that it was profound. It was spectacular because these people are sitting back, and the text says they marveled. All right, the ESV says they marveled at this man's teaching. The connotation there is more of like puzzlement. They're marveling in the sense that they're scratching their head saying, whoa, what's he doing? And notice what they say here. How has he, in verse 15, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? In the Greek, it literally reads, how does he know his letters? How does he know all of this and he's never studied? What's puzzling them is that they know he is not a formally trained rabbi. They know he has not been through the system. They know he has not been through their equivalent of the seminary. And they're shocked because how can somebody who's never been to seminary know so much about the Bible? And that's what's puzzling them. They're saying he's never studied. How has he? I mean, if in those days, if you were gonna study under a rabbi, that was rigorous. That was rigorous. First of all, you had to earn your place, and that rabbi might just be like, "No, you're not good enough for me." But you had to earn your place, and then you had to follow that rabbi, and then he would put you through this grueling system of memorization and recitation and just learning, and you would have to go where he went and follow him around and basically live in his shadow for some period of time. It was grueling, but that's what they thought it took to learn the scriptures. That's what they thought it took to go deep and to really, really have a good solid theology and to go deep with the scriptures. That's what they thought it took, and that's why they're puzzled. In those days, if you were a Jew, you would have some knowledge of the scriptures. If you, quote unquote, went to church every week and you heard the sermons, you would know some Bible stories. You would have some stuff, but they're sitting back like, whoa, This dude knows way too much. How do you know so much? And they're shocked by it. It's a depth of knowledge that's boggling their mind, and they don't expect anybody who has not been formally trained to have that depth of knowledge. And quite frankly, they're amazed by it. They're marveling. They're puzzled. And if we're being honest, this attitude, this kind of attitude persists today. Because today, and I don't mean anything I'm going to say to sound like harsh or scolding. I want it to sound encouraging. I want it to sound uplifting. But there are just so many Christ followers today that are content. They're content with just the base level, just the most base level understanding of the Bible. They're content with just the most surface level theology, just the absolute basics. And they're content with that. They're complacent with that. And a lot of times there's this attitude that it's like everybody else's job. It's the pastor's job to study and to preach. It's the Bible study teacher's job to study and then teach the text. It's that guy on YouTube's job to know what he's talking about. So when I pull up the video, he'll give me some good word for the day. It's everybody else's job. It's his job to study. It's their job to study, so I don't have to. You do your studying for me, and then just tell me what you come up with. And all I want to say to you this morning is this is patently wrong, and this is a bad attitude to have. And it's going to only hurt you in the long run. And that's really the truth of it. And I want to just walk through with you two counterexamples from Scripture that is going to shatter this mindset. The first one is a very famous example from Acts chapter 17, verses 10 through 12. And this is what that text says in Acts chapter 17, verses 10 through 12. Some of you have heard this before, I'm sure. But it says, the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And so they're talking about the church sending these people off to teach and preach. And it says they sent them away by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. Now pay attention to this. It says, now these Jews, the ones in Berea, the Bereans, these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Many of them therefore believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing as well as men. Now let me just tell you what I just read there. All right, these Bereans, they were not formally trained theologians. They were not graduates of the Berea Seminary. They were not some sort of advanced degree candidates, PhD students, none of that kind of stuff. These were church members. These were church members. They were just regular men and women who showed up and, quote unquote, went to church. They were just regular Jews. That's what they were. They were just regular Jews. But what we see here is they would hear the teaching and they would go home and they would actively search the scriptures themselves. They would look it up themselves to see if the things they were being taught were true. They looked it up for themselves. And for this, the text says they were more noble than the other ones. Not less noble, not the same. It wasn't 6 one way, half dozen the other, apples and oranges. No, the text said they were more noble. It is more noble for you to study the scriptures for yourself, so you will know if every word you hear out of my mouth or any other pastor, preacher, Bible study teacher, YouTube personality, social media influencer, you will know if they're telling the truth or not. You are more noble than you would be to not do that. You are more noble if you study the scriptures for yourselves. My second counterexample is Jesus' disciples themselves. The example of Jesus' disciples. I would also remind you that, when Jesus was walking around the earth and he called 12 disciples to his side. And these were the 12 men who went on to be called apostles. And these were the 12 men who followed him around and studied with him and learned under him. These 12 men that he chose, they were not products of the rabbinical schools. If Jesus wanted the quote-unquote seminary students, if Jesus wanted the trained theologians, he could have gone to trained theologians. He had access to Pharisees. He had access to the Sadducees. He had access to the scribes. He had access to the priests. There were any number of people he could have gone to if he was thinking to himself, you know who I'd really like is those trained theologians, those people with the advanced degrees, those people with the advanced education. That's who can serve me the best. If that was his mindset, he could have done that. But every single one of those 12 men were just regular people working regular jobs. They were us. They were just people. They were just people. Most of them were fishermen. They didn't have advanced degrees. They didn't have advanced knowledge or education. They were just people. And maybe this will help kind of put this into perspective a little bit. I was actually reflecting on this. You know, if Jesus were in Gretna right now, if Jesus came back and said, haha, fooled you, it's, the second coming is me coming to Gretna, and he starts walking around Gretna saying, okay, I'm back for a little while, and I need some new disciples. I came alone, so I need some new disciples. And if Jesus came through that door, he said, you know what, I'm going to go to that church. If he comes through that door right now, and man, if he did, man, this would be awesome. But if he came through that door right now and said, all right, I'm here for some disciples. I need 12 people. I'm looking around this room. I don't know who he would pick. I know at least 2 people in this room for sure he would not pick. And I'm just going to tell you right away, I'm out. I'm out. He's not looking to me. He's not. Based on the data that we have here, I'm excluded. Jesus is absolutely picking 12 people from these pews. That's who he's choosing. He's choosing from among you. Think about that. I hope that's encouraging. I hope that is. And it's a reminder that it doesn't take some big degree or anything like that. Jesus just wants people who are willing to follow him. Lest I remind you, the disciples that he did pick, they did not become powerful kingdom workers because they had an MDiv or a PhD. They became powerful kingdom workers because they walked with Jesus. That's what did it. Day in and day out, they went where he went. They walked with him. They did what he did. When he told them, hey, you go over there and do this, they did it. They walked with him. They lived with him for 3 years. Apparently, that's all it takes is 3 years. After 3 years of walking right next to Jesus, in step with Jesus, they were ready to go out and quite literally turn the world upside down. Think about that. 3 years with Jesus, and they were ready. But the crowd's assumption was that you had to have formal rabbinical training to know the deep things of God. And they were mistaken. And that's why in verses 16 through 18, we see Jesus kind of pushing back against that type of reasoning. If you read through those verses, you see him pushing back. He's saying things like, my teaching is not from me. I'm not making this stuff up. It comes from the Father. You'll know, because if I was trying to glorify myself, you would know. But I'm not. I'm trying to glorify the Father. And so he's pushing back against all of that. But here's the point of all this. Seminary education, formal theological training, all of this is great. I'm a big fan. It's great if you're going into vocational ministry, or if you want to be like an academic in a university somewhere, or if you want to be a certified Christian counselor, go for it. Absolutely. But studying this word and getting proficient in this word, this is for everybody. This is for everybody that calls on the name of Christ. You don't need some degree. You should be doing this. This is for everybody. There's absolutely nothing holding anybody in here back. Not one of you. There's nothing holding any one of you back. from studying and learning just as much about the Bible, just as much theological context as any pastor you know, as any Bible study teacher you know, as any preacher you know. There is nothing holding you back from learning point for point every bit as much as they do. Everyone in here should be like the Bereans, studying the scriptures for yourself daily to know the truth from the error. Let me be clear. Let me just be clear. Pastors, preachers, people that do like I do, there is nothing magical about what we do. There is nothing magical. I don't have some magic formula that makes me do more or know more or study more. Nothing. There is nothing I do in my sermon prep time that you can't do in your living room with your Bible in your lap. There's nothing I do in my sermon prep time when I'm getting ready to preach a sermon, when I'm studying a text to preach a sermon. There is nothing I'm doing with that text that you can't do in your own living room with your own Bible. There's one difference. All right, is I have to then figure out how to communicate it. All right, so I have to take one more step and figure out how am I going to preach this. But other than that, it's the same. Other than that, let me tell you. Let me just give you a quick little snapshot of the process here. I sit down with this word. I pick out my block of text. I read it over and over and over again, and I ask myself, what's the main idea of this text? If I had to just give a 1 or 2 sentence summary of what is the main thing this guy, maybe it would be better if I was pointing to the actual word and not my hand. What is the main idea that this guy is trying to say to these people? If I had to sum it up in 1 or 2 sentences, what is the main point of what this guy is trying to say? And then I start looking at the words themselves and what those words mean. And what I want to know is, if I'm one of these guys in the first century hearing this for the first time, what am I thinking? How am I hearing these words? What is this author trying to tell them? And then from there, I'm just asking myself, hey, I'm trying to extrapolate, okay, now, what are the general truths? What are the universal truths that's kind of holding that up? All right, this is what John said in this text. Okay, what are the general truths and the universal truths that are propping that up? What are the truths about God? What are the truths about mankind? What are the truths about the world? What are the truths about just sin? Like, what are the universal truths that's propping that up? And then from there, okay, what would it look like in my life if I took those same general principles and applied those to my situation? What would that look like? And if it's a text I'm going to preach, I'll ask that question on your behalf. What would it look like for you if you applied those principles? And that's what I try to communicate. But when I'm sitting there running through that process, I'm doing the exact same thing that any good student of the Bible should do. Now, I will admit I do have access to tools and resources. All right, I have other tools and resources I use. You know what? You can have access to those same tools and resources. We can talk about that. For about $20 or $30, you can get yourself a good Bible dictionary. You know what a Bible dictionary does? It does the same thing a dictionary does, except it's all Bible words. There's something you want to look up, like, oh, George keeps talking about Feast of Tabernacles. Okay, well, there's an entry in that Bible dictionary for the Feast of Tabernacles. Read up. $20, $30, you can get yourself a good Bible dictionary and read up. You can get yourself a good little Bible atlas. Study the maps, study the geography. Oh, that's where Jerusalem is in relation to Nazareth. Okay, that makes more sense now. Why, Jesus was in Galilee avoiding the people trying to kill him. Oh, because there's like several days journey and he's safer there. You start making these connections. You can get like a Bible survey and learn more about the Jewish culture. So some of this stuff can make more sense. You can experiment with different Bible study techniques. Just find out what works for you and what doesn't. It's one of my favorite things to do is sit down with somebody and talk to them about how to study the Bible. We can talk about that. We can walk through all of that. My point in saying all this is that deep learning is not just for seminarians. You can do this. You can do this. And you should do this. And you should want to do this. And it's in your best interest to do this. Please don't be content with a superficial knowledge of the Bible. Please don't be content with just a base level theology. Go deep. Go deep. Get to know God better. Get to know Jesus better. Go deeper in your faith. You will, not only will you get to know God better, but you will be better in the process. You will be more grounded. You will be more joyful. You will feel more well-rounded. You will be a better person. It's gonna have a holistic appeal, and we should all strive for this. My second encouragement is that there's also no law degree required. All right, we talked about seminary degrees, enough about that. There's no law degree required either. As we move into verses 20 through 24, we start to see this tension emerging between the application of the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. And that's kind of that tension that we're seeing in verses 20 through 24. And just so we're on the same page, let me just kind of briefly define these terms so that we know what we're talking about. Whenever we talk about the letter of the law, if you're looking at a law and you're talking about the letter of the law, you want to know, what do those words say? And what do those words actually mean? When you talk about the spirit of the law, we're referring to the people who wrote the law, and we want to know, what were they thinking when they wrote it? What were they trying to accomplish? And believe it or not, sometimes the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, you can run into some interesting little conflicts where, applying both might seem to cause a little tension. Case in point, 2009 in Ohio, guy gets a very bright idea in his head and attaches a lawnmower engine to a bar stool and puts wheels on it, fashions a steering system, and designs a bar stool that can be driven. So despite his engineering prowess, he then made the very unwise decision of consuming 15 beers. This has been documented. He drank 15 beers, and then he took his bar stool out for a spin on public roads. He's driving up and down the street. And what does he do? Surprise, surprise, he crashes the stool. He crashes his bar stool on a public street. And the police show up, and the police are like, "That's a DUI, mister." And this guy fought the ticket in court. He fought the ticket in court, and his defense, at least in part of his defense, rested on the definition of motor vehicle. And what he argued was, a bar stool is not a vehicle, and therefore DUI laws should not apply here. And he fought this thing, and the law won. Because what we ended up with was like a letter of the law versus spirit of the law conflict. What does dictate or define a motor vehicle versus what was the intention of the law in the first place? I don't know. Maybe we just don't want intoxicated people driving around on the roads, putting people's lives in danger. The court deliberated. They're like, you lose. The DUI stands. So the court, in this case at least, sided with the spirit of the law and threw him out, threw his case out. In verses 20 through 24, we see a great application of these principles when Jesus tells the crowds, don't judge by appearances, but by right judgment. Not by appearances, but by right judgment. And this is another key difference between those people who only have a superficial awareness of the Scriptures and those who truly know the Scriptures. Because the ones with only a superficial awareness, they tend to look at the words themselves and just kind of get a base level understanding of what the words actually say without any real understanding of the context or what those words actually mean in the larger context. And then they will kind of pluck that out and they'll just go with that. And unbelievers do this all the time, by the way. I see this all the time. For some reason, unbelievers love to do this. They'll find a verse in the Bible that says something that looks like it says what they want it to say, with not really understanding what it's actually doing there. They'll pluck it out, and they'll weaponize it, and they'll hurl it back at Christians and like start lecturing us on how they think we should be behaving. And a lot of times they're using these verses out of context in this, but we see it all the time, and we're seeing this same kind of conflict in verses 20 through 24. Jesus mentioned Moses. Jesus said, Moses gave you the law, but you're not following the law. Why are you seeking to kill me? They're like, dude, you're crazy. What are you talking about? Who's trying to kill you? Who's trying to kill you? Now remember, these are like travelers. These are people who most of these people have come into Jerusalem because for the festival. They're not actually from Jerusalem. They legitimately might not know about the plot to kill Jesus. There is a plot to kill Jesus, but they probably don't know anything about it. So whether they literally think he has a demon or if that's just a euphemism for like, man, you're crazy. Either way, they're like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about here? And so then Jesus goes on in verse 21 and says, I did one work, one, and you all marvel at it. And what he's probably referring to there is back in chapter 5, you remember that paralytic guy he healed? And that's what kind of kicked off this whole plot to kill Jesus in the first place. And if you remember, the whole scandal with that was it happened on the Sabbath. He healed the man on the Sabbath. He told the man, pick up your mat and walk. All of this happened on the Sabbath, but you're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath. But then he gets to the heart of the matter when he brings up the law. He says in verse 22, he brings up the fact that you'll perform a ritual circumcision on the Sabbath. Now, if you didn't know this already, a Jewish male baby was supposed to be, according to the law, circumcised on the 8th day, when they were 8 days old. But what do you do if the Sabbath falls on that 8th day? What do? Now you have two laws that seem like they're conflicting with one another. Do we circumcise because the law says to circumcise? Or do we not circumcise because the law says don't do work? Because that's considered work for the priest to perform a circumcision on the Sabbath. And Jesus points out, he's like, look, you understand that to bring that baby into sort of like the covenant, this is a right, an initiatory right to bring this baby into the covenant. You understand intuitively that takes precedence over the Sabbath. So you will actually set the Sabbath aside, and the circumcision takes priority over the Sabbath in those cases. He points that out to them. But he's like, hey, if performing a circumcision, which is done on one part of the body, and is meant to kind of bring this baby into the covenant, in a sense, it's like an initiatory rite, then how much more so should it take precedence over the Sabbath if I want to heal a man's whole body and make the whole man well? He's like, you guys are just missing it. You guys are just missing it. We forget, God, or they forget, God made a covenant with the people. That covenant in itself was an act of grace and mercy. He didn't have to do that. It was an act of grace and mercy. And Jesus is trying to tell them, look, these rules that you made up and you're adding on to the covenant, those rules are having the opposite effect. God was trying to show grace and mercy. These rules you're making up are violating that. And so they've gone way off with it, whereas everything Jesus is doing is in perfect harmony with both the letter and the spirit of the law. See, there was a spirit of the law when God set up the covenant. He was trying to show grace and mercy. The letter of the law that they made up was violating the spirit of God's law. See what I'm saying there? The letter of man's law and the spirit of God's law were in conflict. Jesus, there is no conflict. What Jesus was doing was in perfect fulfillment, and they're messing the whole thing up. Now, I will clear this one thing up. This doesn't mean that we throw all of our laws and rules out the window. I'm not saying that we just throw all our laws out the window. But what I am saying is that there is an order of operation here, and God's laws come first. So that's why I say you don't need a law degree. God's law comes first. He's already given it to us. He's already shown us the way. But this is another reason why we need to be willing to go deep with Jesus and go deep in our learning. Because if you don't know, and you ever do find yourself in a situation where you see these conflicts happening and you're not sure which way to go, if you ever do find yourself in that situation, how are you going to know? How are you going to know? If you're torn between following some rule or some law of the nation, in your workplace, and if you're going to take some stand, like this is going against my convictions as a Christian, and if you're going to take some stand on theological grounds, don't you hope that your interpretation of whatever scripture you're trying to stand on is the correct interpretation? Because man, wouldn't that be tragic if it wasn't, and you took that stand for nothing, and all you did was get yourself into a world of trouble. I'll close with this. We just saw where Jesus said, do not judge according to appearances, but he said, judge according to right judgment. But here's the question. This is the question I'm going to leave you with. How are you going to know the difference if you are not diligently studying the scriptures for yourself and if you are not diligently spending time with Jesus every day? How are you going to know the difference? Because Jesus does not want lip service. Jesus does not just want us to talk about following him. Jesus wants you. He wants all of you. He wants your heart. He wants your life. He wants you to be completely committed and sold out to him. One of the greatest ironies of life, and I'll give you this to think about. One of the greatest ironies of life is that if you own your own home, then you probably pay a mortgage. But if you pay a mortgage, you don't really own your own home. See how that works? But what do? You send in a payment, right? You send in a monthly payment because the bank owns your house. So you send in this payment every month, and every time you make that payment, you're buying back a little bit of that house. You're buying back a little bit of that house. You're getting that loan down, and you're buying back a little bit of it. But every month you make that payment, that house becomes a little bit more yours. The end game being, hey, one day you're going to own that home outright. One day you are going to own that home. That home is going to be yours. Well, I want you to think of every personal encounter you have with the Lord. I want you to think of every single morning you spend in Bible study. I want you to think about every deep prayer time you have. I want you to think about every time that you just sit down and have some quiet time and you're alone with God. Every one of those encounters, every time you do that, I want you to think about those as little bitty deposits that God is making into your spiritual life and your spiritual well-being, so much so that one day he will own you outright. That's how I want you to think about that. The end game being that one day he owns you. And if that sounds scary, don't be scared. That is not bondage. That is freedom. That is freedom from all the things that actually used to hold you in bondage. That is freedom from those addictions. That is freedom from that lust. That is freedom from the anger and the bitterness and all those things that actually do put us into bondage. It's freedom. Being owned by God is true freedom. Let's pray.